Hey guys, tonight we begin with the most famous face in ancient Egypt, and possibly its greatest historical plot twist. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin with the face. Not the political chaos, not the religious revolution, not the mysterious disappearance. The face. In 1912, a German excavation team working in the ruins of Amarna uncovered what looked like a sculptor's studio. Dust, broken fragments, half-finished works. And then, sitting there as if waiting for her lighting cue, they found her. Nefertiti, perfectly sculpted. High cheekbones, sharp enough to cut papyrus. Smooth skin, that long, elegant neck. And the iconic blue crown rising like she already knew she'd win the branding contest 3,000 years later. One eye was missing, which somehow made her even more famous, because apparently imperfection photographs better. The world was stunned. She didn't look ancient. She looked modern, like she could step off a runway in Milan and politely dethrone everyone else. And just like that, she became the face of ancient Egypt. But here's the part nobody puts on the souvenir mugs. That bust was probably not meant to be the final portrait. Most scholars believe it was a workshop model, essentially a sculptor's reference piece. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a sample image pinned on a studio wall. So yes, the most recognizable queen in human history may have achieved global immortality because someone forgot to clean up their practice draft. That's not mythic destiny. That's excellent timing. And yet look closer. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The symmetry, the pigment blending, the subtle curve of the lips. This was not a rushed assignment. Even as a model, it was executed with precision. Ancient Egyptian art was not casual decoration. It was propaganda carved in stone. Representation equaled importance. So if this was just the reference version, imagine how powerful the full royal imagery must have been. And then there's her expression. Calm, controlled, slightly detached, not smiling, not frowning. It's the face of someone who knows more than you, which might be fitting, because before we even touch the question of whether she ruled as king or vanished on purpose, we have to admit something. Nefertiti mastered image, or at the very least, someone around her understood the value of visual control. And if history is written in stone, she made sure her face would survive long enough to make us argue about her forever. Not bad for a practice piece. Now that we've admired the cheekbones long enough, let's talk power. Nefertiti was the great royal wife of Pharaoh Akhenaten. And if that sounds like a standard royal marriage, it wasn't. Akhenaten was not your average pharaoh. Most Egyptian rulers worked within a well-established system. Honor the gods, keep the priests happy, build temples, win wars, repeat. Akhenaten looked at that system and said, politely but decisively, no. He elevated Aten, the sun disk, above all other gods, not as part of the divine lineup, not as first among equals, as the main event. Centuries of tradition? Replaced? Powerful priesthood of Amun? Politely sidelined. Temples? Closed or repurposed? That's not religious reform. That's a theological earthquake. And Nefertiti wasn't standing behind him holding flowers. In reliefs from Amarna, she appears nearly equal in size to the king. In Egyptian art, size matters. The larger the figure, the greater the importance. And she is not scaled down like a decorative spouse. She performs rituals. She makes offerings to Aten. In some scenes, she even smites enemies, a pose traditionally reserved for pharaohs, which raises an eyebrow. Queens were influential, yes, but they weren't typically depicted acting like co-rulers in official state imagery. This wasn't symbolic fluff. This was messaging. Akhenaten and Nefertiti presented themselves as a divine partnership. Aten's rays extend toward both of them, ending in tiny hands that offer life symbols equally. That's not accidental. That's branding. And if Akhenaten was restructuring religion to centralize power around himself, Nefertiti was clearly part of that consolidation. She wasn't ornamental. She was strategic. Some scholars even argue she may have served as co-regent later in his reign, effectively ruling alongside him, which makes the title Great Royal Wife feel incomplete. Because what we're seeing in these carvings doesn't look like a supportive spouse. It looks like shared authority. And that's where the mystery deepens. Because if she was already acting like a ruler while he lived, what happened when he didn't? Now, to understand Nefertiti's role, we need to understand just how radical this religious shift really was. Ancient Egypt did not casually change gods. They collected them. Over centuries, Egypt developed a sprawling pantheon. Amun, Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Hathor, divine departments for everything from fertility to the afterlife. Temples were economic powerhouses. Priests controlled wealth, land, and influence. Religion wasn't just spiritual. It was political infrastructure. Then Akhenaten stepped in and said, essentially, we're simplifying. Aten, represented as the physical sun disk, became the supreme deity. Other gods were not necessarily declared non-existent, but they were pushed aside. Their temples closed, their names removed from monuments. When you erase a god's name in ancient Egypt, that's not symbolic. That's aggressive. And Nefertiti stood right beside him during this transition. Art from the Amarna period shows something unusual. The royal family is depicted in intimate domestic scenes, kissing children, sitting together beneath Aten's rays. The sun's beams end in tiny hands offering the Ankh, the symbol of life. And those hands don't just reach Akhenaten, they reach Nefertiti too. This is subtle but powerful. It visually reinforces that divine favor flows through both of them. She is not just queen, she is part of the divine conduit. That's revolutionary imagery. Egyptian art was deeply formulaic for thousands of years. Suddenly, proportions change. Bodies are elongated, faces narrow, scenes feel almost personal. It's as if the entire visual language of Egypt shifted overnight, and Nefertiti adapted flawlessly, or perhaps helped design it. Because this wasn't random artistic experimentation, it was ideological messaging. By centralizing worship around Aten and presenting themselves as the exclusive intermediaries between God and people, Akhenaten and Nefertiti tightened control. Less priesthood, more royal authority. And if the king was the primary bridge to Aten, the queen stood right beside him on that bridge. Which means her power was not secondary. It was embedded in the theology itself. And when religion and politics merge like that, removing one figure from the equation becomes very complicated, especially if that figure knows exactly how the system works. If you are going to overturn centuries of religion, sideline the most powerful priesthood in the country, and declare a near monotheistic devotion to the sun, you probably don't want to stay in the old capital. Too many reminders, too many critics, too many angry priests. So Akhenaten did what any confident revolutionary would do. He built an entirely new city from scratch. Akhetaten, Horizon of the Aten. Today we call it Amarna, fresh land, fresh temples, fresh start, no old gods watching from the walls. This was not just relocation, it was symbolic separation, a physical break from Thebes and the traditional centers of power, and Nefertiti moved with him. In fact, she didn't just move, she flourished there. The art from Amarna is unlike anything Egypt had produced before. Gone were the rigid, eternal poses of earlier dynasties. Instead, we see the royal family in intimate, almost tender scenes. Akhenaten and Nefertiti sit together beneath Aten's rays, playing with their daughters. It feels almost human. And in these depictions, Nefertiti is everywhere, nearly equal in size to the king, participating in rituals, offering to attend independently. In some reliefs, she even drives a chariot. That's not background decoration, that's visibility. Amarna wasn't just a city, it was a stage, and the royal couple were the central performers in a carefully constructed narrative, divine, unified, chosen by the sun itself. Which raises an interesting thought. If you are redesigning religion, architecture, and artistic style all at once, you are also redesigning how power is perceived. And Nefertiti understood perception. Her presence in Amarna art is not passive. It is assertive, intentional, structured. She is not simply shown supporting the king. She mirrors him. And in a society where symbolism equals authority, mirroring is not trivial. It's strategic. Amarna was supposed to represent a new order, Aten above all. The royal family as divine intermediaries, and Nefertiti at the very center of that structure. But revolutions are fragile, and when a new system depends heavily on image and unity, what happens when one half of that image disappears? That's when the illusion begins to crack. By the time Amarna was in full swing, something subtle and slightly unsettling was happening in the art. Nefertiti wasn't just standing next to power, she was starting to look like it. In several reliefs, she wears the blue crown traditionally associated with royalty. She appears in poses that were once reserved strictly for pharaohs. In one striking image, she smites enemies. Arm raised, posture firm, body positioned exactly as kings had done for generations. That's not symbolism you hand out casually. In ancient Egypt, the act of smiting enemies wasn't just about military strength. It was a visual declaration of authority. It told the world, I rule, I protect Ma'at, the divine order. I am the one standing between chaos and civilization. And here was Nefertiti, doing it, confidently, without apology, which naturally raises a question. Was she being depicted as unusually powerful for a queen? Or was she already functioning as something closer to co-ruler? Some scholars argue that in the later years of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti may have taken on the role of co-regent. This would mean she shared formal ruling authority, not just ceremonial presence. If true, that changes everything. Because once you share the throne, you don't simply step back into the background, and then the names begin to shift. Around the later years of Akhenaten's rule, inscriptions mention a figure named Neferuaten. Sound familiar? Nefertiti's full name included Neferuaten, Nefertiti. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe this was a transition. Egyptian pharaohs adopted throne names upon ascending to full kingship. If Nefertiti became co-ruler, or even sole ruler after Akhenaten's decline, she would have needed a royal name aligned with tradition. And if she did take on such a role, she would also need to adjust how she was presented visually. Less queen, more king. And that might explain why some depictions show a shift, a more masculine portrayal, a more formal presence. Ancient Egypt had precedent for this. Hatshepsut, centuries earlier, adopted male regalia when she ruled as pharaoh. It wasn't deception, it was protocol, which brings us back to the title of this video. Did Nefertiti fool the world? Or did she simply understand that in order to rule, sometimes you must change the mask you wear? Because in Egypt, power wasn't just inherited, it was performed, and she may have been very good at performing it. After years of visibility, authority, and near equal representation beside the king, Nefertiti disappears. Not gradually, not ceremonially, just gone. Around year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, her presence in the historical record drops off dramatically. Reliefs stop mentioning her. Inscriptions shift. The once constant royal pairing begins to fragment. For someone so visually dominant, the silence is deafening. Now, in ancient Egypt, royal events were documented carefully. Births, deaths, jubilees, building projects, especially for figures as central as the great royal wife. If Nefertiti had died suddenly, we would expect some form of formal acknowledgement, a tomb scene, a mourning inscription, a ritual commemoration. Instead, we get ambiguity, and historians do not enjoy ambiguity, so theories began. Maybe she died during a plague that struck the royal family. Several daughters are believed to have died around this period. Disease was not uncommon, but if plague took her, why no official death record? Royal death was not a small administrative detail. It was a state event. Others suggest something more political. Perhaps she fell from favour. Perhaps internal tensions emerged within the court. Religious revolutions create enemies, and enemies sometimes wait for opportunities. But again, where is the evidence of disgrace? Erasure usually leaves marks. Scratched out names, destroyed images. With Nefertiti, it's not violent removal. It's absence. And absence in Egypt is dangerous, because when a name vanishes, so does identity in the afterlife. Unless the name didn't vanish, unless it changed. Which brings us back to Nefertiti. Around the same time Nefertiti fades from view, a ruler bearing that name appears in inscriptions. Some believe this was a separate individual, perhaps a short-lived co-regent. Others suspect something more elegant. What if Nefertiti didn't disappear? What if she transformed? In ancient Egypt, identity was fluid at the highest levels of power. Pharaohs adopted throne names, divine titles, layered identities. If Nefertiti stepped into kingship, she wouldn't remain Nefertiti the Queen. She would become something else. And that might explain why we cannot find her. Not because she vanished, but because we've been looking under the wrong name. And if that's true, then the illusion wasn't her disappearance. It was our assumption that she ever truly left. So let's follow the name, Nefertiti. It appears in inscriptions after Nefertiti fades from view, sometimes paired with epithets that translate roughly to effective for her husband or beloved of Akhenaten. Notice the word her. That's important. Because pharaonic names were not casual labels. They were layered statements of legitimacy. If Nefertiti carried feminine grammatical markers in certain inscriptions, that narrows the field. It suggests a female ruler. And in that period, there aren't many candidates. This is where the debate intensifies. Some scholars argue Nefertiti was Nefertiti ruling as co-regent, or even briefly as sole pharaoh after Akhenaten's decline. Others propose she was one of their daughters. Still others introduce another shadowy figure, Smenkhkare. Ancient Egypt loved a good succession mystery. Smenkhkare appears briefly toward the end of Akhenaten's reign, possibly as co-regent. The problem is that Smenkkare's identity is frustratingly unclear. Some think he was a male relative. Others suggest he may have been Nefertiti under a different royal persona. And here's where things get deliciously complicated. When women ruled as pharaoh in Egypt, they often adopted masculine imagery and titles. Not because they were disguising themselves in a theatrical sense, but because kingship itself was linguistically and ritually male. To rule, you fit the mould. Hatshepsut did it centuries earlier. She wore the false beard. She appeared in male regalia. Not deception. Institutional compliance. If Nefertiti became Nefertiti, or even Smenkhkare, she would have needed to navigate that same framework. Which means any shift in iconography might not signal replacement, it might signal adaptation. The deeper historians dig, the murkier it becomes. Inscriptions are damaged, cartouches are incomplete, names overlap, titles blur. It's like trying to assemble a political thriller from half-burned documents. But here's the key tension. If Nefertiti truly ruled, even briefly, then her disappearance wasn't disappearance at all. It was transformation. And transformation in ancient Egypt required something critical. Control of narrative. Because if you are rewriting religion, founding a new capital, and possibly stepping into kingship, you must also manage how history records you. And maybe she did, maybe too well. Because 3,000 years later, we're still arguing about whether she left the stage or simply changed costumes. Whether Nefertiti ruled as Nefertiti or not, one thing is certain, the revolution did not last. After Akhenaten's death, the carefully constructed world of Amarna began to unravel with impressive speed. Temples to Aten fell out of favour. Priests of the old gods quietly reclaimed influence. The capital city was abandoned, statues defaced, names erased. Egypt had tried something radical, and Egypt decided it preferred the classics. Enter Tutankhaten, later known as Tutankhamun. The boy king ascended the throne young, and almost immediately his name changed, from honouring Aten to honouring Amun. That is not subtle. That is a theological U-turn. Under Tutankhamun, traditional religion was restored. The old gods were welcomed back like they'd just been on vacation, rather than aggressively sidelined. And this is where things get uncomfortable for Nefertiti. If she had been deeply tied to Aten's revolution, as queen, co-regent, or even king, then the restoration of the old order would not favour her legacy. History in ancient Egypt was not neutral. It was curated. Akhenaten's name was later chiselled out of monuments, his reign treated as an aberration, Amarna dismantled, his religious experiment reframed as heresy. If Nefertiti ruled in that unstable transition period, her memory could have been politically inconvenient. Not hated, not cursed, just inconvenient. And when something is inconvenient in a system built on stone inscriptions, you don't debate it, you erase it. Which might explain the strange silence. No triumphant end, no preserved tomb inscription declaring her divine ascent. Instead, we get fractured references, partial names, ambiguous cartouches. The dream of Aten, the shining sun over a newly built city, collapsed quickly. And anyone too closely associated with that dream risked being absorbed into its failure. If Nefertiti had positioned herself at the centre of that revolution, then when the revolution failed, her identity may have gone down with it. Not because she lacked power, but because power shifted. And when power shifts in ancient Egypt, history shifts with it. Which leaves us with a haunting possibility. Maybe Nefertiti didn't fool the world. Maybe the world that followed her simply chose not to remember her clearly. Now, let's bring in the golden boy, Tutankhamun. The most famous pharaoh in the world, not because of what he accomplished, but because his tomb was discovered mostly intact. Gold mask, glittering treasures, international headlines. But here's the inconvenient detail. Tutankhamun's family tree is complicated. DNA studies suggest he was the son of Akhenaten. His mother, however, appears to have been one of Akhenaten's sisters, not Nefertiti, which raises a few eyebrows. If Nefertiti was not his biological mother, what was her role during his rise to power? Stepmother, political guardian, rival? And if she did briefly rule under another name before Tutankhamun, that makes the timeline even more delicate. Because here's what we know. After Akhenaten's death, Egypt entered a short and unstable transition period. There may have been co-regents. There may have been overlapping rulers. Names appear and disappear frustratingly quickly. Then suddenly, Tutankhaten becomes Tutankhamun. Religion restored. Capital moved back. Old gods reinstated. Which suggests that whoever held power between Akhenaten and Tutankhamun did not maintain control for long. If Nefertiti ruled during that in-between period, she would have been standing at the edge of a collapsing ideological structure. And if she opposed the restoration of the old gods, or even simply symbolized the Aten revolution, she would not fit neatly into the new narrative, which creates a delicate political problem. How do you legitimize a young king restoring tradition if the previous ruler represented radical change? You minimize the transition. You simplify the story. You smooth the timeline. And sometimes you leave certain names out of the summary. Tutankhamun's reign focused on stability, repairing temples, reassuring the priesthood, calming a shaken religious system. That kind of reset does not benefit from highlighting a powerful queen who may have briefly ruled under a controversial theology. So whether she died, ruled, or negotiated quietly behind palace walls, by the time Tutankhamun's golden mask was buried beneath the Valley of the Kings, Nefertiti's story was already fading. Not erased completely, just blurred. And sometimes blurring is more effective than destruction, because destruction leaves scars. Blur leaves mystery, and mystery lasts much longer. Now here's where the mystery shifts from politics to archaeology. We still have not definitively found Nefertiti's tomb. Let that sink in. One of the most visible women in ancient Egyptian art, possibly a co-regent, possibly a pharaoh, the central figure in a religious revolution, and we do not know where she is buried. For ancient Egypt, that's strange. Royal burials were monumental undertakings, carefully planned, elaborately decorated, documented. Even when later rulers tried to erase predecessors, tombs usually left traces. But Nefertiti? Nothing confirmed, which has launched decades of speculation. Some researchers suggest she may have been buried in Amarna, the revolutionary capital. Others argue her remains could be hidden in the Valley of the Kings. There was even a theory, popular a few years ago, that a hidden chamber behind Tutankhamun's tomb walls might contain her burial. Imagine that twist. The Golden Boy's tomb hiding the revolutionary queen. Ground-penetrating radar scans were conducted. Headlines exploded. For a moment, it felt like the mystery was about to crack open, but the evidence was inconclusive. Again, which leaves us with an unsettling possibility. If Nefertiti ruled under another name, especially briefly, her burial might not be labelled Nefertiti at all. It could be inscribed under Neferuaten, or another throne name entirely. And if her political legacy became inconvenient during the restoration of traditional religion, her tomb could have been repurposed, damaged, or quietly obscured. Ancient Egyptian history is full of reused monuments, erased cartouches, overwritten names. Stone was permanent. Names were not. There's also a more dramatic possibility. What if her burial was never completed properly? If political transition happened rapidly, ritual continuity might have been disrupted, or perhaps her tomb exists, undiscovered, somewhere beneath desert sands, waiting for the right excavation. For a queen whose face became one of the most recognized in the world, it's almost poetic. We know her features. We debate her power. We argue over her identity. But we do not know where she rests. And that absence keeps the mystery alive. Because as long as her tomb remains hidden, the final chapter of Nefertiti's story remains unwritten. If Nefertiti did transition into another identity, whether as Neferuaten, Shmenkare, or something still debated, then we're not just dealing with a disappearance. We're dealing with reinvention. And ancient Egypt was surprisingly good at that. Pharaohs didn't just have one name. They had several. Birth names, throne names, divine epithets. Each shift in power came with a shift in identity, a rebranding exercise carved into stone. So if Nefertiti stepped into kingship, she wouldn't announce it like a modern press release. She would alter titles, adjust imagery, adopt the correct regalia, because kingship wasn't personal, it was institutional. And institutions demand uniformity. If you were going to rule Egypt, you needed to fit the mold of Pharaoh. That meant specific iconography, specific rituals, specific language. If that required adjusting how you were portrayed, so be it. Hatshepsut had done it before. She ruled as pharaoh centuries earlier and adopted male regalia, including the ceremonial beard. Not because she was hiding her identity, but because the office of king came with visual expectations. It wasn't deception. It was compliance with tradition. So if Nefertiti assumed power under a different name, any shift in appearance might not signal replacement. It might signal transformation. And here's where the fooled the world idea becomes interesting. We tend to look for clear lines in history, clear successions, clear deaths, clear rulers. But ancient politics was often layered. Co-regencies overlapped, names evolved, titles shifted. If Nefertiti ruled briefly under another identity, she may have successfully navigated a system designed to limit female authority, not by confronting it directly, but by adapting within it. Which is a different kind of power, subtle, strategic, less dramatic, more effective. And if she did this during a period of religious instability and political tension, then her ability to maintain control, even briefly, would have required careful image management. Which brings us back to that face. Calm, controlled, almost unreadable. If she mastered visual identity in life, it would not be surprising if she mastered it in death. Maybe she didn't fool the world. Maybe she simply understood it well enough to survive inside it, at least for a while. And survival, in ancient Egypt, was often the most difficult victory of all. If Nefertiti did hold real power, whether openly or under a throne name, then her fading from history may not be accidental. It may be strategic. Ancient Egypt did not treat history like a neutral archive. It treated it like a curated exhibition. When rulers fell out of favor, their names were chiseled out of monuments, their statues smashed, their contributions reassigned. Erasure was not emotional. It was administrative. Akhenaten is the clearest example. After his death, later rulers dismantled his religious revolution. His name was omitted from king lists. His monuments were dismantled and reused as building material. Imagine rewriting history by recycling it. If Nefertiti was deeply intertwined with that revolution, then preserving her memory would preserve the revolution itself, and that was inconvenient. When Tutankhamun restored traditional religion, stability required a clean narrative. Egypt had briefly experimented with Aten worship, but now the old gods were back. Order was restored, balance returned. Highlighting a powerful queen who may have ruled during that unstable transition would complicate the message. So what do? You minimize. You simplify. You let ambiguity do the work. Instead of publicly condemning her, which would draw attention, you allow her identity to blur. Cartouches damaged, names partially preserved, titles fragmented. Not enough to destroy her completely. Just enough to make certainty impossible. And uncertainty is powerful. Because without clear evidence, historians debate instead of conclude. It's subtle, but effective. There's also a practical angle. If her reign was short, transitional, or politically fragile, it may not have left monumental building projects to anchor her legacy. No massive temple complex, no colossal statues bearing her throne name. Without monuments, memory weakens. Ancient Egypt remembered through stone. If stone did not fully record you, you faded, which leaves us with an uncomfortable thought. Perhaps Nefertiti did not vanish through mystery or tragedy. Perhaps she was gently edited out of the narrative because her story no longer fit the restored order. And if that's true, then the greatest illusion was not hers. It was the illusion that history is objective. Because history, especially in ancient Egypt, belonged to whoever held the chisel last. Let's be honest. If Nefertiti did not have that bust, we might not be having this conversation. Her face became the gateway drug to her story. When the bust was unveiled in Berlin, it wasn't just archaeologists who were impressed. The public was captivated. Newspapers called her the most beautiful woman of antiquity. She became a cultural icon almost immediately. And that might be the most ironic part of all. Because beauty is distracting. We focus on the symmetry, the elegance, the aesthetics. We turn her into a symbol of timeless attractiveness. Meanwhile, her political influence, her possible co-regency, her involvement in a radical religious overhaul, those become footnotes beneath cheekbones. It's almost unfair. If a male ruler had engineered a theological revolution and possibly seized kingship during a volatile transition, we would frame him as cunning, strategic, ambitious. With Nefertiti, the narrative often begins with her appearance. She becomes the beautiful queen first, the revolutionary second, and that framing shapes perception. It softens her. It makes her safe. But the evidence from Amarna suggests she was anything but passive. She appears in authoritative poses. She participates in state rituals. She mirrors the king in scale and posture. That's not ornamental power. That's functional influence. Yet modern memory reduces her to aesthetic perfection. which unintentionally may mirror what happened in antiquity. If later rulers wanted to neutralize her political legacy without fully attacking it, allowing her to drift into symbolism would work perfectly. She becomes an image, an icon, a face. And once someone is reduced to image, their agency becomes negotiable. It's possible Nefertiti didn't fool the world through deception. It's possible the world fooled itself. We saw the face and assumed we understood the person. We admired the art and overlooked the strategy. And that may be the most enduring illusion of all, because when we think of Nefertiti, we don't first imagine a political operator navigating one of Egypt's most unstable periods. We imagine elegance, and perhaps that elegance concealed far more power than we're comfortable admitting. By the time Tutankhamun's golden mask was lifted from the sands, the world had a new obsession: gold, treasure, drama. A teenage king wrapped in layers of immortality. And just like that, Nefertiti, the woman who helped reshape an entire religious system, was overshadowed by a child whose greatest achievement was dying with excellent interior decoration. History can be cruel like that. Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered almost intact. That kind of archaeological jackpot doesn't just rewrite textbooks, it rewires public imagination. Suddenly, the narrative of late 18th dynasty Egypt became centered on the glittering boy king. Nefertiti, whose tomb remains undiscovered and whose reign is debated, faded into background mystery. But here's the thing. Tutankhamun inherited a kingdom in chaos. The religious revolution had fractured traditional power structures. The capital had been relocated. The priesthood had been alienated. The political climate was unstable. Someone had to navigate that. If Nefertiti lived into that transitional period, whether as co-regent, rival, advisor, or even briefly as king, she would have been operating in one of the most delicate moments in Egyptian history. And delicate moments rarely produce monuments. They produce survival strategies. Tutankhamun's reign restored balance by re-embracing traditional gods. That was politically brilliant. It stabilized the priesthood. It calmed the populace. It repaired diplomatic relationships. But restoring order also required simplifying the story. The Aten experiment became a footnote. Akhenaten's radicalism softened. The transition period blurred. And Nefertiti's potential authority during that blur became harder to trace, not because she lacked significance, but because significance that complicates stability tends to be smoothed over. So the boy king became the headline. The golden mask became the symbol. And Nefertiti, the woman who may have co-authored the revolution and possibly navigated its collapse, became a question mark. History often rewards spectacle over subtlety. Tutankhamun had spectacle, Nefertiti had subtlety, and subtle power leaves fewer shiny artifacts. But perhaps that's fitting, because if she truly mastered image, narrative, and reinvention, then fading into ambiguity might not be a failure. It might be the final, most elegant move of all. After everything, the revolution, the co-regency debates, the name changes, the vanishing act, the missing tomb, we're left with the original question. Did Nefertiti fool the world? Maybe, but not in the way you think. There's no evidence she staged an elaborate deception or orchestrated some grand theatrical disguise. Ancient Egypt was not a palace soap opera, at least not entirely. What she may have done, however, is far more impressive. She navigated one of the most unstable periods in Egyptian history with remarkable visibility and adaptability. She stood beside a king who dismantled centuries of religious tradition. She appeared in roles traditionally reserved for male rulers. She possibly stepped into kingship during a fragile transition, and when the system shifted again, her identity dissolved into ambiguity rather than outright condemnation. That's not accidental incompetence. That's political survival. If she ruled briefly under another name, she understood that authority required transformation. If she faded deliberately during the restoration of traditional religion, she understood that sometimes the smartest move is retreat. And if later rulers softened or blurred her memory, that suggests she mattered enough to manage carefully. The irony is this: we remember her because of a face, but that face may be the least important thing about her. The bust gave her immortality. Her political maneuvering gave her mystery, and mystery is powerful, because certainty closes conversations. Ambiguity keeps them alive for 3,000 years. Maybe she didn't fool the world. Maybe she allowed the world to see exactly what it wanted: beauty, elegance, serenity, while operating within the very real, very sharp edges of ancient power politics. Or maybe history simply fractured around her, leaving us with pieces that refuse to assemble cleanly. Either way, here we are, still debating, still searching for her tomb, still wondering whether she ruled, vanished, or transformed. And perhaps that's the true legacy of Nefertiti. Not a final answer, but a question that refuses to disappear. The caravan wakes before the sun does. There is no gentle alarm clock here. Only the low, irritated groan of camels and the quiet curses of men who slept on sand that still remembers yesterday's heat and last night's cold. The sky is a deep blue bruise, stars fading one by one as if retreating from responsibility. You sit up, brush dust from your cloak, and immediately taste grit between your teeth. Welcome to another glorious day on the Silk Road. Around you, movement begins in layers. A handler checks the camel's padded saddles, tightening leather straps with practiced hands. Each animal kneels reluctantly as bundles are hoisted onto its back. Bolts of silk wrapped in waxed cloth to protect them from sand, sacks of pepper and cinnamon worth more than some villages, delicate Persian glass cushioned in straw, and small locked chests containing jade carved so finely it looks like frozen water. Nothing here is random. Weight is balanced with obsessive care. Too much on one side and the camel will lurch for miles like a drunk nobleman at a feast. Too little and you waste precious space. Every knot matters. Every strap is inspected twice. A single failure in the desert is not an inconvenience. It is an obituary. You walk past the line of animals, counting them quietly. 32 camels, 12 men, 2 hired guards who look as if they trust no one, including each other. At the center stands the caravan master, already awake, already calculating. He does not shout. He does not need to. A glance from him carries more authority than any blade. The horizon begins to glow faintly. Soon the sun will rise and turn this frozen landscape into an oven. Travel must begin now, while the air is still merciful. Waterskins are checked. Turbans are adjusted. Daggers are secured at the waist. Not because you plan to use them, but because you would be foolish not to. You look east for a moment, toward lands already behind you. Then west, toward months of uncertainty. The Silk Road is not a road. It is a gamble stretched across continents. And as the first light spills over the dunes, you realize something simple and terrifying. You are already all in. By the time the sun fully rises, mercy is already gone. The desert does not gradually warm. It transforms. One moment the air is sharp and cold, the next it presses against your skin like a furnace door left open. Light floods the dunes, flattening shadows and blinding the careless. You wrap your cloth tighter around your head, leaving only your eyes exposed. Even the camels seem to sigh as the caravan begins to move. The rhythm sets in quickly. Step, sway, step, sway. 32 camels walk in a loose line, their padded feet sinking softly into the sand. Bells tied to a few harnesses ring faintly, not for decoration, but to keep the line together in poor visibility. The sound becomes hypnotic, a metallic heartbeat against the silence of the desert. You walk beside the third camel, close enough to monitor its load. Silk must not shift. Glass must not crack. Pepper must remain dry. Every item on these animals has travelled thousands of miles already, passing through hands that spoke different languages and prayed to different gods. Now they are in your care, and the desert has no sympathy for carelessness. Conversation is sparse. Talking wastes moisture. Instead, you observe, The horizon never seems closer. Dunes rise and fall like frozen waves. Occasionally you spot what looks like water shimmering in the distance. A lake, a line of trees, relief. But it is always a mirage. The older traders do not even look up anymore. Hope is expensive out here. Around midday, the heat becomes personal. It presses into your skull. Sweat evaporates before it can cool you. Your tongue sticks slightly to the roof of your mouth. Water is rationed carefully. A small sip, not enough to satisfy, only enough to continue. One of the younger men stumbles. The caravan does not stop immediately. Stopping costs time and time costs water. Eventually the master raises his hand. A brief pause. The man is helped up, his pride bruised more than his body. He nods silently. No one mocks him. Tomorrow it could be you. The desert is not loud, but it is relentless. And as the caravan keeps moving, you understand something else. Out here, survival is not dramatic. It is repetitive. It is patient. It is earned one step at a time. By late afternoon, the silence begins to change. Not in sound, in feeling. The desert still stretches endlessly, dunes rising and collapsing into one another like sleeping giants. The wind still moves in low sighs across the sand. The camels still sway in that steady, almost arrogant rhythm. But beneath the surface, tension tightens like a drawn bowstring. You notice the guards first. They begin walking slightly farther from the main line, scanning ridges and distant rock outcroppings. One keeps his hand resting casually near the hilt of his curved blade. Casually, but not lazily. The other narrows his eyes at every shifting shadow. Bandits prefer patience. They wait for fatigue. They wait for complacency. The Silk Road does not just carry silk. It carries rumour. 2 nights ago, at the last oasis, another caravan arrived half its original size. Ambushed, near a dry ravine. Survivors spoke of riders appearing at dusk, faces wrapped, horses lean and fast. They did not kill everyone. That would be inefficient. They took the most valuable goods and left the rest to crawl toward the next water source with whatever dignity remained. You try not to imagine it. Instead, you focus on small details. The way the sand crunches faintly under leather sandals. The way the sun begins its slow descent, turning the sky from white-hot glare to muted gold. The way heat gives way, slightly, to something almost breathable. The caravan master calls for a brief halt atop a low ridge. From here you can see miles in every direction. Empty, beautiful, deceptive. He speaks quietly, but everyone listens. No fires tonight until walls surround you. No loud talk after dusk. Weapons within reach at all times. He does not dramatize the threat. He simply acknowledges it. Fear is useful, but panic is fatal. As the march resumes, your senses sharpen. Every dark speck on the horizon could be a rock. Or it could be men watching, calculating the weight of your cargo against the effort of taking it. The bells on the camels continue their soft ringing. Peaceful. Almost innocent. But as the sun dips lower and long shadows stretch across the sand, you realize something unsettling. Out here, danger does not announce itself. It studies you first. Just as the sun begins to sink into a haze of copper and dust, you see it. At first, it looks like a mirage again, a low rectangle interrupting the horizon. But this time, it does not shimmer. It grows larger. Walls, solid, square, unapologetic. A caravanserai. Relief spreads quietly through the line. No cheers. No foolish displays of emotion. Just a subtle loosening in shoulders, a slight increase in pace. Even the camels seem to sense the promise of rest. The structure rises from the desert like a fortress built by patience. Thick mud brick walls, high and nearly windowless, designed to keep out wind, sand, and men with bad intentions. A single heavy wooden gate stands open, guarded by 2 men who look bored but alert. the most dangerous combination. As you pass through the gate, the noise changes instantly. The desert's vast silence is replaced by contained life. Hooves clatter against packed earth. Traders speak in half a dozen languages. Someone laughs too loudly. The air smells of sweat, animals, spices, and smoke. Inside the courtyard, the camels kneel one by one. Loads are inspected carefully before being removed. You run your hands over the silk bundles, checking for tears. The glass crates are intact. The jade chests remain locked. For today, fortune has allowed you to keep what is yours. Along the inner walls are small rooms for merchants. Not luxurious, but solid. A roof, a door, protection. In the centre, a shallow well and troughs for animals. A stable boy moves quickly, collecting coins before offering water. You finally remove your head covering. Sand falls from your hair. Your skin feels tight from salt and heat. Someone hands you a small bowl of lentil stew and flatbread. It tastes better than any feast because you are still alive to eat it. Oil lamps begin to glow as darkness settles. Conversations grow softer, more conspiratorial. Deals are whispered, prices negotiated in careful tones, news exchanged like currency. Which routes are safe? Which rulers demand higher tolls? Which regions are unstable this season? You sit against the cool inner wall, watching shadows flicker. Outside these walls, the desert waits without emotion. But tonight, you have stone between you and it, and for a caravan on the Silk Road, that is luxury beyond silk. Night inside the caravanserai does not mean rest, it means business. The courtyard that felt chaotic at dusk now settles into pockets of controlled activity. Oil lamps hang from hooks along the walls, their flames trembling in the warm night air. Shadows stretch and overlap, distorting faces, softening intentions. Under this kind of light, everyone looks slightly mysterious, slightly untrustworthy, which, frankly, is accurate. You sit cross-legged on a woven mat with 3 other traders. Between you lies a small wooden chest. It contains nothing dramatic, just silk, but not ordinary silk. This bolt is dyed a deep, almost impossible shade of blue, achieved with pigments that require time, skill, and access to resources most men will never see. The buyer runs his fingers over the fabric slowly. He does not compliment it. He does not frown. He simply measures his reaction carefully. The performance has begun. You name a price. He exhales softly, as if you have insulted his ancestors. He counters with a number that would be amusing if it were not meant to be serious. Back and forth you go, voices low, expressions controlled. The goal is not to win dramatically. The goal is to leave both parties believing they have been clever. Around you, similar scenes unfold. A Persian trader offers glass bowls so thin they almost sing when tapped lightly. A man from farther west unwraps small bricks of fragrant resin used in temples. Another displays spices in tiny piles, their scent cutting through the stable smell of animals. Whispers carry information beyond goods. Rumours of rising taxes in one city. Bandits spotted along a northern pass. A new governor who favours certain merchants over others. On the Silk Road, knowledge travels faster than camels. You keep one ear open to everything. Near the gate, the guards remain posted. Even here, within walls, trust is limited. Coins change hands quickly. Goods are never left unattended. A man who smiles too easily is watched twice as carefully. Eventually, hands are shaken. The blue silk changes ownership. Silver coins slide into your pouch with a weight that feels reassuring, but you know better than to relax. Tonight, you made a profit. Tomorrow you will carry that profit back into a desert that does not care how clever you were under lamplight. After the deals are struck and the coins counted, the caravanserai shifts again. Business fades. Humanity remains. You sit near a low fire in the centre of the courtyard, its flames carefully contained in a shallow pit. Sparks rise briefly before vanishing into the night. Around you gather men from lands so distant that their childhoods unfolded under completely different constellations. A trader from the east begins to speak first. He tells of mountains so high that breathing becomes a negotiation, of narrow passes where caravans move single file, one misstep separating life from legend. He laughs lightly as he describes losing half a shipment of porcelain to a landslide. "The mountain wanted plates," he says with a shrug. Another man, darker-skinned and soft-spoken, speaks of monsoon rains that swallow roads whole, of jungles that hum with insects so loud they sound like machinery. His spices, he explains, were once green and alive before being dried and packed for this endless migration across continents. You listen, aware that these stories are more than entertainment. They are maps disguised as memory. Every anecdote carries warning. Every joke hides instruction. The guards sit slightly apart, cleaning blades by lamplight. One occasionally glances toward the gate. Trust the walls, but verify them. Someone passes around a small cup of fermented drink. It burns going down. You accept only a sip. Intoxication is a luxury for people not crossing deserts. Above you, the sky is clear and enormous. Stars stretch from horizon to horizon, indifferent and ancient. You recognize a few constellations. Others are unfamiliar, named differently by different tongues. Even the sky, it seems, has multiple versions, depending on who is telling the story. Laughter breaks out suddenly from one corner of the courtyard. A man imitates the exaggerated bargaining style of a rival merchant, complete with dramatic sighs and wounded pride. For a moment, the Silk Road feels almost light-hearted, but the fire burns low eventually. Conversations thin out. One by one, men drift toward their small rooms or sleeping mats beside their goods. You lie back, cloak wrapped tightly around you. Tomorrow, the walls disappear again, and stories will once more give way to survival. Morning departure is smooth. Too smooth. The gate creaks open at first light. Camels are loaded with the same careful precision. Silver coins are redistributed discreetly across belts and hidden pockets. The courtyard empties, and once again, the desert welcomes you back with blank indifference. For the first few hours, the march feels routine. The sky is pale and wide. The wind is steady but harmless. You almost begin to believe the day will pass without incident. Then you notice the horizon, a faint line, darker than the sky, thicker than cloud. One of the older handlers stops walking. He narrows his eyes, squinting into the distance. He does not need to announce it. The caravan master sees it too. Sandstorm. Orders come quickly and without drama. Camels are brought closer together. Faces are wrapped tightly with cloth. Loose fabric is secured. Delicate goods are reinforced with extra bindings. No one wastes breath on complaint. The line on the horizon grows taller, wider. It moves with unsettling speed. Within minutes, the wind shifts from steady to aggressive. It pushes at your back first, then circles unpredictably. The air thickens. The sky begins to disappear behind a moving wall of dust. "Down!" someone shouts. The camels kneel, trained for this moment. You drop beside one, pressing yourself against its broad body for partial shelter. The first blast hits like a physical force. Sand strikes your face, your hands, any exposed skin. It stings. It invades. The world becomes noise. Wind roars in your ears. Grains of sand whip against leather and cloth like endless tiny projectiles. Visibility shrinks to almost nothing. You can barely see the camel beside you, let alone the rest of the caravan. Breathing becomes deliberate, through cloth, slow, controlled. Panic wastes oxygen and focus. Time stretches strangely inside the storm. Minutes feel like hours. The desert is no longer empty and distant. It is inside your eyes, your mouth, your thoughts. You cling to the rope, tethering the camels together. Let go, and you could wander 10 steps and vanish completely. Eventually, gradually, the roar softens. The wall moves on. When the air clears enough to see, the landscape is altered. dunes reshaped, tracks erased, the path forward uncertain. And as you stand, brushing sand from your cloak, you understand a brutal truth. Out here, even the ground beneath you refuses to stay the same. When the last gust finally loosens its grip, silence returns in fragments. At first, it is only the absence of roaring wind. Then you hear the camels shifting, shaking sand from their long lashes. A man coughing, another muttering something between prayer and complaint. The world feels stunned, as if the desert itself is catching its breath. You stand slowly. The caravan no longer looks like a line. It looks like survivors. Sand has buried half the packs. Fine dust coats every surface, cloth, skin, rope, even the metal buckles dulled to the colour of ash. You run your hands over the nearest bundle of silk. The outer wrapping is abrasive with grit, but intact. You exhale, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge that fortune has not abandoned you entirely. Count, the caravan master says. Not loudly, calmly. You count camels first. One by one, brushing sand from their faces, checking straps. 32 becomes 31. A pause. Voices call out across the uneven dunes. A handler climbs a newly formed ridge and scans the area. After a tense minute that feels much longer, a shape moves in the distance. A camel, partially buried, struggling to rise. Two men rush toward it, pulling at its harness, coaxing it upright. 32 again. Next, the men. 12. All present. One with a bloodied lip from being struck by flying debris. Another with raw skin where cloth shifted in the wind. Nothing fatal. The desert showed its strength, but not its cruelty. Not today. The greater problem is less visible. The storm has erased the road. Tracks that once pointed west are gone, swallowed under newly shaped dunes. Landmarks have shifted. A familiar ridge now appears unfamiliar. In a landscape already ambiguous, certainty has been sanded away. The master studies the sun's position. Another trader consults a small wooden board etched with stars and directional notes. Navigation returns to older methods now. Sky, memory, instinct. You drink a measured sip of water. It tastes faintly of leather and dust. It is perfect. The caravan reforms slowly, deliberately. No one speaks of fear. But as you begin walking again, stepping onto ground that did not exist yesterday, you understand something deeper. The Silk Road does not promise safety. It promises endurance. And endurance out here is everything. Days pass after the storm, blending into one another like layers of wind-shaped sand. You no longer measure time by sunrise and sunset alone. You measure it by aches, by the slow thinning of water skins, by the subtle shift in conversation from confident plans to quiet calculations. Distance is not dramatic, it is cumulative. The camels move with steady resignation, but even they begin to show strain. One limps slightly, its padded foot irritated by a stone hidden beneath soft sand. Another refuses water for a moment, turning its head stubbornly before finally drinking. You watch them closely. A camel lost is not merely inconvenience. It is weight redistributed onto others. It is margin shrinking. The men feel it too. Tempers shorten. Jokes grow rarer. Silence stretches longer between exchanges. You notice how often hands drift toward belts where coins are hidden, as if checking to ensure the entire journey still has purpose. Wealth means nothing if you do not survive to spend it. At midday, the heat returns with ruthless familiarity. The horizon trembles with mirages again, but this time no one even glances at them. Hope is rationed like water now. That afternoon, a new tension emerges. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, you see movement parallel to your path. Not close, not threatening, just there. A small group of riders silhouetted against the dunes, keeping pace. The guards notice immediately. No panic, no sudden change in direction. That would signal weakness. Instead, The caravan tightens formation slightly. The bells on the camels are muffled. Weapons remain visible, but not drawn. The riders do not approach. They watch. Hours pass like this. Two lines moving through the same ocean of sand, separated by space and intention. You cannot tell whether they are bandits weighing risk, rival traders assessing opportunity, or nomads simply curious. Eventually, as the sun dips lower, the riders veer away. They dissolve into the dunes as quietly as they appeared. Relief does not come loudly. It comes as a subtle release in your shoulders. The caravan continues west, and as you walk, tired but unbroken, you realize that the Silk Road is not defined by its grand exchanges of silk and jade. It is defined by the quiet decision, made again and again, to keep moving. In the spring of 1701, beneath the lacquered beams and whispering corridors of Edo Castle, honour cracked. Lord Asano Naganori of Akko was not a reckless man. He was young, yes, proud certainly, but reckless? No. He had been summoned to the shogun's capital to perform a ceremonial duty, to host imperial envoys from Kyoto. It was a prestigious task, wrapped in ritual and suffocating precision. Every bow measured, every word rehearsed, every step choreographed as if the entire empire were watching. Because it was. To guide him through this maze of etiquette stood Kira Yoshinaka, a senior court official. Experienced, polished, and, if rumours were to be believed, very aware of his own importance. In Edo, influence was currency. Favours were expected. Gifts were customary. Generosity was wise. Asano either failed to understand the game or refused to play it. Accounts differ, but they agree on one thing. Kira did not treat him kindly. Corrections were sharp. Instructions were delivered with a cutting tone. Some say Kira mocked him openly, calling him uncultured. Others suggest insults were more subtle, the kind designed to sting without drawing blood, until blood was drawn. On the 14th day of the 3rd month, inside the Matsu no Oka corridor, something broke. Words were exchanged. Perhaps an insult went too far. Perhaps pride outweighed patience. In a place where drawing a sword was strictly forbidden, Asano did the unthinkable. He reached for his blade. Steel flashed under palace light. It was not a long duel. It was a slash fueled by humiliation and fury. Kira was wounded, though not killed. Guards rushed in immediately. Swords were seized. The corridor that had witnessed countless ceremonies now held something far more dangerous. Defiance. The shogunate moved swiftly. There would be no investigation into motives. No sympathy for wounded pride. Asano had drawn a weapon inside the shogun's palace. That alone was enough. He was ordered to commit seppuku that very day. By sunset, Lord Asano was dead. And with his death, his samurai became ronin, masterless, stripped of purpose. But what the shogunate saw as an ending, history would remember as a beginning. By nightfall, the house of Asano no longer existed. Confiscated. That is the word the shogunate used. Efficient. Legal. Final. Akko Castle was seized. Lands were redistributed. Officials arrived with scrolls and seals, measuring property that had once belonged to one man and now belonged to the state. Servants were dismissed, accounts frozen, banners taken down, and the samurai? They were dismissed into nothing. In Edo and back in Akko, men who had sworn lifelong loyalty to Lord Asano suddenly found themselves without a master, without income, without status. Samurai in name, but hollowed of purpose. In a rigid society where identity was everything, this was not just unemployment. It was erasure. 47 of them would become famous, but at that moment they were simply men standing in uncertainty. At the center of them stood Oishi Kuranosuke, Asano's chief retainer. Calm, measured, observant. He had served his lord faithfully. He had watched the humiliation unfold from a distance. And now he watched the aftermath with careful silence. Custom demanded obedience to the shogunate's ruling. Asano had broken the law. The punishment had been delivered. The matter officially was closed. But loyalty is rarely satisfied by official statements. Among the former retainers, whispers began. Some argued for immediate revenge. Storm Kira's residence, die gloriously. Restore honor through swift bloodshed. It would be dramatic. It would also be suicide. Others counseled patience. Oishi said little at first. He understood the stakes. Kira still lived in Edo, protected, cautious, likely expecting retaliation. Any reckless attack would end in failure and disgrace. Weeks passed. The men scattered deliberately. Some returned to farming, others took minor positions. A few even appeared to drift into idleness. To outside observers, the former samurai of Akko looked broken, defeated, absorbed back into ordinary life. That illusion was intentional, because beneath the surface of apparent surrender, something else was forming. Grief was hardening into resolve. They had lost their lord, they had lost their lands, but they had not yet decided to lose their honor, and that decision would take far longer and demand far more than a single reckless strike. If revenge were easy, it would not be legendary. Oishi Kuranosuke understood this better than anyone. Kira would be expecting fury, a quick, dramatic retaliation, something loud, something desperate. What Kira would not expect was patience, so patience became the weapon. The former retainers of Asano did not gather in secret camps or whisper in dark corners every night. They dispersed. Some shaved their top knots and blended into merchant districts. Others took humble work. A few returned to family lands, behaving as if the fire inside them had gone cold. And Oishi himself? He made a deliberate choice that shocked many. He moved to Kyoto and began living what appeared to be a life of indulgence. He drank heavily. He visited tea houses. He staggered through the streets as if grief had destroyed his discipline. Word spread quickly. Oishi has fallen, people murmured. The chief retainer drinks away his shame. The rumors travelled exactly where they needed to go, to Edo, to Kira. Spies reported that the once respected samurai was now a broken man, frequenting pleasure quarters, sleeping in doorways, publicly disgraced. One story tells of a samurai who spat on Oishi in the street for failing to avenge his lord. Oishi did not respond. He simply endured the humiliation, because humiliation was cheaper than suspicion. Back in Edo, Kira slowly relaxed. Guards remained posted, but the tension eased. Months passed. Then more months. Seasons turned. The urgency of revenge seemed to dissolve into ordinary life. But beneath the surface, quiet coordination continued. Letters were exchanged carefully. Trusted messengers carried coded updates. The men saved money, secured weapons, mapped Kira's residence. Every detail was studied. Gates, guard rotations, neighbouring houses. Precision replaced anger. Oishi waited until even his own allies questioned him. That was part of the plan. The longer he appeared weak, the stronger his eventual strike would be. And so, for nearly 2 years, the Ronin wore masks. Of merchants, of farmers, of drunkards, of men who had accepted defeat. But acceptance was never the truth. It was camouflage. Because in Edo, in the winter of 1703, Kira Yoshinaka would learn something dangerous. A patient enemy is far more terrifying than an angry one. By the winter of 1703, the waiting was over. Snow had begun to fall over Edo, settling quietly along rooftops and narrow streets. It softened the city's sharp edges. It muffled footsteps. It concealed intention. On the night of the 14th day of the 12th month, the Ronin moved. 47 men gathered in silence. No drunken staggering now. No disguises of failure. Armour was light but practical. Swords were sharpened. Each man carried not just a blade, but a decision that could not be reversed. Oishi divided them into 2 groups. One would approach from the front gate, the other from the rear. Speed and coordination mattered more than spectacle. They were not seeking chaos. They were seeking one man, Kira Yoshinaka. The snow continued to fall as they advanced through the sleeping city. Neighbors, sensing something unusual, stayed indoors. This was not the first time Edo had seen violence. But there was something different about this night. An eerie calm, as if even the cold air understood what was unfolding. The front gate was breached first. Guards shouted, startled from their posts. Steel clashed in the courtyard, sharp and immediate. The Ronin fought with discipline, not frenzy. They subdued resistance quickly, careful not to harm women, servants, or children within the residence. Their quarrel was precise. Inside, lantern light flickered wildly as men moved room to room, searching. Kira was nowhere to be found. Minutes stretched. Panic threatened to creep in. Had he fled? Had their years of patience ended in failure? Then, in a storage shed at the rear of the compound, hidden among firewood and supplies, they found him. Kira was trembling. He was older now, smaller than the man who had humiliated their lord. Time and fear had stripped him of grandeur. Oishi stepped forward and identified himself formally. He offered Kira the same dignity their master had been granted, the opportunity to commit seppuku and die with honor. Kira refused. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps he would not. Oishi did not argue. He drew his blade and struck. Snow continued to fall over Edo as the 47 Ronin severed Kira's head, wrapping it carefully in cloth. The waiting was finished, but the consequences were only beginning. When the fighting ended, the Ronin did not flee. That, perhaps, is the most astonishing part. With Kira's head wrapped in white cloth, they formed into a solemn procession and stepped back into the snow-covered streets of Edo. It was still early morning. The city was quiet, but not for long. Word travels quickly when blood has been spilled. As they walked, neighbors opened sliding doors cautiously. Lanterns were raised, faces emerged from shadows. Some recognized the story immediately. Others only saw armed men moving with eerie calm through the winter dawn. The Ronin did not hide their purpose. They were heading to Sengakuji Temple, the burial place of their lord, Asano Naganori. Their steps were deliberate. No running, no shouting, no triumph. This was not celebration. It was completion. By the time they reached the temple grounds, snow clung to their armor and sleeves. Their breath rose in slow clouds. Monks, startled by their arrival, stepped back as Oishi approached with formal composure. Before Asano's grave, they placed Kira's severed head. The symbolism was unmistakable. They washed it carefully in a well near the temple, not out of cruelty, but ritual clarity. Then they presented it at their master's tomb, bowing deeply, as if reporting to him in life. We have fulfilled our duty. For nearly 2 years, they had lived as shadows. Now, standing before the grave, they were once again samurai, if only for a moment. But duty fulfilled did not erase law broken. They knew the shogunate would respond. They had attacked a high official. They had killed inside the capital. However justified their motives felt, the government could not ignore the act, so they did something even more extraordinary. They surrendered. The Ronin dispersed peacefully to the residences of sympathetic daimyo, awaiting official judgment. They did not attempt escape. They did not plead innocence. They had acted with full awareness of consequence. In Edo, debate ignited like dry tinder. Were they criminals who defied the state? Or were they the very embodiment of samurai loyalty? The answer would shape not only their fate, but the moral imagination of an entire era. Edo did not sleep easily after the attack. In tea houses, merchant stalls, and samurai compounds, the same questions circled like winter wind. Were the 47 Ronin heroes or criminals? The shogunate faced a dilemma. Law was clear. The Ronin had carried out an armed assault in the capital and killed a high-ranking official. Order demanded punishment. If vengeance became acceptable simply because it felt righteous, The entire structure of Tokugawa authority would begin to crack. But honor was also clear. Asano had been forced to commit seppuku for drawing his blade inside Edo Castle. His retainers had waited patiently, endured humiliation, and avenged him without harming innocents. They had then surrendered peacefully. In a society built on loyalty between lord and vassal, their actions resonated deeply. Public opinion leaned in their favor. Commoners admired their discipline. Samurai saw in them a mirror of their own ideals, loyalty unto death. Even some officials quietly respected their restraint and planning. The shogun, Tokugawa Tsunayoshi, could not ignore either side of the argument. Mercy might inspire further acts of private revenge. Execution like common criminals would insult the samurai code and risk unrest. So a compromise emerged. The Ronin would be sentenced to death, but not by executioner's blade. They would be permitted to commit seppuku. This was not leniency, it was recognition. Instead of dying as criminals, they would die as samurai. In early 1703, the sentence was delivered. The men were divided among 4 daimyo households to carry out the ritual, each prepared carefully. White robes were worn, final letters were written. Some composed death poems, brief reflections capturing the essence of their lives and loyalty. There was no screaming, no resistance. One by one, they performed the ritual. A blade to the abdomen, a second to deliver the final cut. Discipline until the last breath. When news spread through Edo, it did not spark outrage, it sparked reverence. Because in the eyes of many, the 47 Ronin had proven something profound. They had chosen loyalty over life, and in doing so, they transformed a private act of vengeance into a national legend. Death did not silence them. It amplified them. The graves of the 47. Ronin at Sengakuji quickly became a place of pilgrimage. Commoners travelled from distant provinces to kneel before the stones. Offerings were left. Incense, coins, folded prayers. Mothers told their children the story in hushed voices, not as gossip, but as moral instruction. Loyalty, endurance, sacrifice. These were not abstract virtues anymore. They had names carved in stone. Writers wasted no time. Within months, pamphlets circulated recounting the event. Official censorship tried to soften certain details, wary of glorifying rebellion. So playwrights adapted. They changed names, shifted settings, moved the story into fictional pasts to avoid offending the shogunate directly. The most famous retelling became Chushingura, the treasury of loyal retainers. On kabuki stages, audiences watched stylized reenactments of betrayal, patience, and snowy revenge. Actors exaggerated emotions. Drums echoed during battle scenes. Snow fell in carefully arranged flakes beneath lantern light. The audience knew the truth behind the fiction, and that knowledge made the performance electric. Tea houses buzzed with debate. Some insisted the Ronin had upheld the purest form of Bushido, the way of the warrior. Others quietly questioned whether obedience to the state should outweigh loyalty to a fallen lord. The tension between personal honor and public law lingered. But legend prefers clarity over ambiguity. Over time, nuance faded. The story hardened into ideal. The 47 Ronin became symbols of unwavering fidelity. Schoolchildren learned their names. Artists painted the snowy assault. Poets composed verses about loyalty stronger than life itself. Even centuries later, their tale would resurface again and again, in prints, novels, films, and whispered conversations about what honor truly demands. The irony is unavoidable. A single moment of anger in a castle corridor led to forced suicide. That suicide created masterless men. Those men chose revenge. That revenge led to ritual death. And from that chain of violence emerged one of Japan's most enduring moral legends. The Ronin did not intend to become myth. They intended to fulfill duty. But history has a habit of turning blood into story, and stories, once born, rarely die. As the decades passed, the story of the 47 Ronin became more than history. It became instruction. In the Edo period, peace had replaced the chaos of earlier wars. Samurai were no longer constantly on battlefields. Many served as bureaucrats, administrators, or guards in a society that valued order above all else. Yet their identity was still tied to Bushido, the warrior's code. The Ronin offered a living example of that code in action: loyalty to one's lord, patience under humiliation, willingness to sacrifice life without hesitation. These were not poetic ideals anymore. They were demonstrated choices, and in a stable, hierarchical society, that demonstration was powerful. But beneath admiration, there was tension. The shogunate had built a system where loyalty flowed upward, from samurai to daimyo, from daimyo to shogun. If private vengeance became celebrated, it risked encouraging personal justice over centralized authority. The state needed obedience. The Ronin embodied something more dangerous: loyalty that transcended law. And yet, the compromise of seppuku had carefully balanced both forces. They were punished, affirming the law. They were honored, affirming the code. This duality shaped how Bushido would be remembered. The story suggested that true loyalty required both discipline and acceptance of consequence. The Ronin did not demand pardon. They did not rebel against their sentence. They embraced it. In that acceptance, they reinforced the very order they had momentarily defied. As Japan moved through the centuries, especially into the modern era, the Ronin's tale was revisited again and again. During times of national uncertainty, their loyalty was invoked as a model of collective devotion. During debates about duty and individual morality, their actions resurfaced as example and warning. Were they perfectly righteous? History rarely offers perfection, but they forced a question that still lingers. When authority and personal honor collide, which one should prevail? The 47 Ronin chose their answer. They chose their lord, and then they chose death. That combination, unwavering loyalty followed by calm acceptance of fate, is what sealed their place not just in Edo memory, but in the moral imagination of Japan itself. Centuries have passed since that winter in Edo, yet the snow has never truly melted. At Sengakuji Temple in modern Tokyo, visitors still stand before the graves of the 47 Ronin. Incense smoke curls into the air, just as it did in 1703. Tourists take photographs. Devotees bow deeply. Children listen as guides recount the night when patience turned into steel. The stones are simple. The story is not. In every generation, the tale is retold slightly differently. Some emphasize loyalty above all else. Others focus on injustice, asking whether Asano's punishment was too swift, too harsh. Some interpret Oishi as a master strategist, the embodiment of disciplined revenge. Others see him as a tragic figure who led 46 men knowingly toward death. Film directors have adapted it. Kabuki actors still perform it. Novelists reinterpret it. Even modern corporations occasionally invoke the Ronin metaphor when speaking of loyalty and sacrifice. But modern audiences also ask harder questions. Was revenge the only path? Could loyalty have taken another form? Was the shogunate's compromise truly balanced, or simply politically convenient? These questions do not weaken the legend. They deepen it. Because the 47 Ronin were not saints carved from myth. They were men shaped by their time, bound by a rigid hierarchy, defined by a code that placed honor above survival. Their choices make sense within that world, even if they challenge ours. And that is precisely why the story endures. It forces reflection. What would you do if your identity were built entirely around loyalty to another? If losing your master meant losing yourself? If patience required humiliation and justice required death? The Ronin answered without hesitation. They waited. They struck. They surrendered. They died. And in doing so, they stepped beyond ordinary life into something far more permanent. Not perfection, not unquestioned virtue, but memory. Snow falls every winter in Tokyo. It melts within days. Yet the snow from that night in 1703 still rests quietly in the imagination, white, silent, and impossibly still. The Teutonic Knights were not born in icy castles or beneath the grey skies of Prussia. They were born in dust and heat. In the late 12th century, during the chaos of the Third Crusade, German pilgrims and merchants in the port city of Acre established a field hospital. Its purpose was humble and urgent: care for sick and wounded crusaders who had travelled thousands of miles in the name of faith and found instead disease, exhaustion, and war. At first, they were simply brothers tending beds, washing wounds, offering prayers over men who would never see home again. But the crusading world did not allow anything to remain simple for long. In a landscape where faith and warfare were inseparable, the hospital brotherhood slowly transformed. By the early 13th century, it had been formally recognized by the Pope as a military order, the Order of the Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem, later known simply as the Teutonic Knights. They would fight, they would pray, and they would bind themselves to a code that was both monastic and martial. Like monks, they swore vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty meant renouncing personal wealth. A knight owned no private estate, no treasure chest filled with spoils. Everything belonged to the order. Chastity meant no marriage, no heirs, no divided loyalties. Their loyalty was singular. Obedience meant unquestioned submission to their superiors, and ultimately to the Grand Master. But unlike monks cloistered in quiet abbeys, these men trained in arms. They wore chainmail beneath white cloaks marked by a bold black cross. They rode war horses. They drilled for combat. They marched beneath banners into battle. It was an unusual fusion. On one hand, discipline and prayer structured their daily lives. On the other, relentless warfare defined their purpose. They were expected to confess sins in the morning and charge into combat by afternoon. Faith was not separate from violence. It justified it. From the beginning, the Teutonic Knights saw themselves as instruments of divine order. To them, expanding Christendom was not ambition. It was obligation. And that obligation would soon carry them far from the deserts of the Holy Land, into the forests and frozen frontiers of northeastern Europe, where their code would be tested in ways even their founders could not have imagined. Once the Teutonic Knights were recognized as a military order, they required more than zeal. They required structure. Their way of life was codified in a written rule, influenced by the Templars and shaped by monastic traditions. It was not poetic, it was precise. It governed everything from prayer schedules to battlefield conduct. A Teutonic knight did not wake when he pleased. He rose for matins before dawn, joining his brothers in chapel as candles flickered against stone walls. Latin psalms echoed through vaulted chambers. Silence followed. Meals were taken in common. Conversation was limited. Often, sacred texts were read aloud, while the men ate in disciplined quiet. The goal was not comfort. It was uniformity. Individual personality was subdued in favour of collective identity. Clothing was standardised. The white mantle with the black cross was not decoration. It was declaration. Purity and sacrifice symbolised in fabric. Beneath it, armour and sword reminded the knight that he was not a cloistered monk. He was an armed servant of God. The vow of poverty did not mean the order was poor. On the contrary, the Teutonic Knights accumulated vast lands and resources over time. But the wealth belonged to the institution, not to the individual. A knight could not claim private property. He could not enrich himself personally through conquest. In theory, greed had no place within the ranks. Chastity reinforced isolation. No wives, no families, no children to inherit ambitions. Loyalty flowed upward, not outward. The order was family. The Grand Master was authority. Brotherhood replaced bloodline. Obedience was absolute. Orders were not debated. They were executed. Discipline maintained cohesion in battle and stability in peace. A disobedient knight threatened not only himself, but the sacred mission of the order. Punishments for breaches of conduct could be severe. Fasting, isolation, public confession, in extreme cases expulsion. Honor was collective, shame was public. This structure forged unity. It also suppressed dissent. The Teutonic Knights were not merely soldiers with faith. They were a system, organized, regulated, and relentless. Their rule ensured that personal doubt rarely interfered with institutional purpose. And as their campaigns expanded beyond the Holy Land, that purpose would shift from defending pilgrims to reshaping entire regions, sword in one hand, prayer in the other. The Holy Land did not remain theirs for long. As Crusader states weakened and Muslim forces regained territory, the Teutonic Knights faced a hard truth. Their original battlefield was shrinking. Acre would eventually fall. The dream of permanent Christian dominance in the Levant was fading, but the order did not dissolve. It relocated. Opportunity emerged not in desert sands, but in the forests and marshes of northeastern Europe. Pagan tribes in Prussia and along the Baltic coast resisted Christian conversion. Local rulers, particularly in Poland and the Holy Roman Empire, saw advantage in inviting a disciplined military order to subdue and convert these populations. The Teutonic Knights accepted. In the early 13th century, they began campaigns in Prussia. What followed was not a brief mission. It was a decades-long conquest. Unlike in the Holy Land, where they were one order among many, here they became architects of a new frontier state. They built fortified castles of brick and stone, massive structures like Marienburg, which would later become the largest castle complex in Europe by land area. These were not temporary outposts. They were statements of permanence. Their warfare was methodical. Campaigns were launched seasonally. Winter often provided strategic advantage. Frozen rivers allowed easier movement of troops and supplies. Pagan resistance was met with brutal suppression. Villages were burned. Leaders were executed or forcibly baptized. Conversion and conquest blurred together. The knights justified it all as sacred duty. To them, this was not imperial expansion. It was holy mission. They were extending Christendom into lands considered spiritually dark. The cross on their cloaks was not symbolic decoration. It was mandate. But this new role altered the order. They were no longer merely warrior monks assisting broader crusades. They became rulers, administrators, governors of territory. They collected taxes, managed trade, negotiated alliances. Power grew, and with power came complexity. Their strict monastic code remained in place, but governing a frontier state required pragmatism that sometimes clashed with pure religious idealism. The Teutonic Knights had left the desert. In the forests of the Baltic, they were building something far more ambitious than a battlefield victory. They were building a theocratic state. And states, unlike monasteries, are rarely simple. In Prussia, the Teutonic Knights did not merely fight. They governed. Their castles were not romantic ruins perched for scenery. They were administrative machines. Thick brick walls surrounded courtyards where soldiers drilled, priests chanted, and clerks recorded taxes. Within these fortresses, the monastic code remained alive, rigid, structured, unyielding. A typical day in a Teutonic stronghold balanced prayer and preparation. The bells rang before dawn. Knights gathered in chapel, cloaks folded neatly over armor racks. Psalms were recited, confessions heard, communion taken. The ritual grounded them. However vast their territories became, their identity was still tied to spiritual discipline. After prayer came inspection. Weapons were maintained with care bordering on ritual. Swords cleaned, mail checked for weak links, horses groomed and fed. Military readiness was constant. In a land where uprisings could ignite quickly, complacency was risk. Meals were communal and restrained. Meat, bread, ale. Silence was often observed. A reader would recite scripture or portions of the rule while the brothers ate. Even nourishment was an extension of obedience. Yet outside the walls, reality pressed in. Local populations, many forcibly converted, required oversight. Settlers from German lands were encouraged to migrate eastward, bringing language, law, and farming practices. trade expanded along the Baltic coast. Grain, timber, amber, and furs moved through ports controlled by the Order. Administration demanded officials, records, diplomacy. Some knights proved more skilled with ledgers than lances. Others found themselves mediating disputes rather than charging into battle. This duality defined their existence. They were monks bound by vows, yet lords overseeing economic networks. They preached spiritual purity while commanding armies. They built chapels beside armories. Over time, wealth flowed into their state. Though individual knights still lived modestly under vows of poverty, the institution itself grew prosperous. Fortresses expanded, armor improved, political influence widened, and therein lay the tension. Could a warrior monastic order remain spiritually disciplined while wielding territorial power? Inside castle walls, routine preserved the illusion of balance. But beyond those walls, rival kingdoms were watching. And some of them were beginning to see the Teutonic knights not as holy crusaders, but as ambitious neighbours. At first, the Teutonic knights were welcomed. Polish dukes and Holy Roman emperors had invited them east to subdue pagan tribes and stabilise a volatile frontier. A disciplined military order seemed like a solution, pious, organised and effective. But solutions have a habit of becoming rivals. As the decades passed, the Teutonic state in Prussia solidified. Fortresses multiplied, trade routes flourished, German settlers populated newly Christianized lands. The Order minted coins, negotiated treaties, and commanded fleets along the Baltic. They were no longer simply crusaders. They were a power. Neighbouring rulers began to notice that the Black Cross did not only mark religious devotion, it marked territory, influence, ambition. Poland, in particular, grew wary. What had begun as cooperation slowly shifted into tension. Disputes over borders hardened. Accusations of overreach surfaced. The language of faith gave way to the language of sovereignty. The irony was sharp. The Teutonic knights justified their presence as a holy mission, bringing Christianity to pagan lands. Yet, once conversion occurred, the justification grew thinner. Continued expansion looked less like spiritual necessity and more like political strategy. Within the order, discipline remained strict. Vows were renewed, prayers recited. But outside, perception was shifting. To the Lithuanians, one of the last major pagan powers in Europe, the knights were relentless invaders. To Polish nobles, they were an unpredictable neighbour occupying lands that might one day be contested. To merchants, they were valuable partners, but powerful ones. The balance between monk and ruler tilted. The more land they controlled, the more they needed armies to defend it. The more they defended it, the more they appeared as secular lords, rather than ascetic warriors. And then came a pivotal moment. In 1410, at the Battle of Grunwald, also known as Tannenberg, a coalition of Polish and Lithuanian forces confronted the Order directly. It was not a minor skirmish. It was a reckoning. The Teutonic knights suffered a devastating defeat. The aura of invincibility cracked. The Black Cross, once a symbol of unstoppable crusade, now faced the reality of geopolitical limits. Their code had forged discipline, but discipline alone could not guarantee dominance. The warrior monks had built a state. Now that state would have to survive in a world that no longer saw them as purely sacred. The defeat at Grunwald in 1410 was not merely military, it was psychological. For generations, the Teutonic knights had advanced with an almost mythic reputation. Their fortresses were formidable, their campaigns relentless, their discipline unquestioned. But on that summer day, facing the combined forces of Poland and Lithuania, something shifted. The battlefield was chaotic. Banners clashed. Armour glinted beneath a heavy sky. The Grand Master himself, Ulrich von Jungingen, rode into combat with conviction and did not ride out. He fell among his men. The loss of a Grand Master in battle was more than symbolic. It fractured confidence. The idea of divine favour, so closely tied to their victories, now faced uncomfortable scrutiny. Had God withdrawn support, or had the order overreached? Though the knights managed to defend key fortresses afterward, most notably Marienburg, the myth of invulnerability was gone. Negotiations followed, concessions were made. The order remained powerful, but weakened. Inside castle walls, discipline continued as before. Matins at dawn, communal meals, obedience to superiors. Outwardly, the monastic code endured unchanged. Inwardly, doubt crept in. The Teutonic Knights had been shaped by crusading ideology, a worldview in which expansion equaled righteousness. But now, the Baltic frontier was no longer a land of pagans. Lithuania itself had converted to Christianity. The religious justification for relentless warfare grew complicated. Fighting fellow Christians did not fit neatly into Crusader narrative. Economic pressures mounted, warfare drained resources, political alliances shifted, secular rulers grew stronger. The centralized power of the order faced increasing resistance from within its own territories. Some local nobles resented heavy taxation. Merchants questioned trade restrictions. Urban populations sought greater autonomy. The image of the knight as holy guardian began to compete with the image of the knight as landlord. The code had forged unity during conquest, but maintaining a state required flexibility. And flexibility was not the order's strongest trait. The Teutonic Knights had built themselves on vows of obedience and permanence. Yet the world around them was changing, politically, economically, spiritually. The cross on their cloaks still shone against white fabric, but the certainty beneath it was beginning to fade. After Grunwald, decline did not come overnight. It came slowly. The Teutonic Knights still held vast territories. Their castles still stood. Their rule still governed daily life. But beneath the surface, political reality was shifting in ways their original monastic vision had not anticipated. The 15th century brought mounting strain. The 13 Years' War between the Order and Poland drained finances and morale. Cities within Prussia, especially wealthy trading centres, grew restless under strict control and heavy taxation. They wanted more autonomy, more influence, less clerical oversight. The outcome was decisive. In 1466, the Second Peace of Thorn forced the order to cede significant territory to the Polish crown. Western Prussia became Royal Prussia under Polish authority. The Grand Master was required to recognise the Polish king as overlord. For a military order that once answered only to the Pope and its own Grand Master, this was a profound shift. Obedience, once directed upward within a self-contained hierarchy, now pointed outward toward a secular monarch. Then came the 16th century, and the Reformation. Martin Luther's ideas spread rapidly across German lands. Criticism of monastic institutions intensified. Celibate warrior monks ruling territories began to look increasingly outdated in a Europe embracing religious upheaval. In 1525, Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg made a radical decision. He converted to Lutheranism. He secularized the order's remaining Prussian territories and transformed them into the Duchy of Prussia, a hereditary secular state under Polish suzerainty. With that act, the Teutonic Knights ceased to rule a sovereign crusader state. The white cloaks and black crosses did not disappear entirely. The order survived in diminished form within the Holy Roman Empire, shifting toward charitable and religious functions. But its era as a conquering theocratic power had ended. The monastic code that once fused prayer and conquest had collided with political reality and religious reform. In the Baltic forests, castles still stood. But they no longer housed warrior monks preparing for crusade. They housed administrators of a duchy, born from the ashes of an order that had once believed itself eternal. Even after their territorial power faded, the Teutonic Knights did not vanish entirely. The order survived, smaller, quieter, stripped of empire, but still structured by its ancient rule. In the Holy Roman Empire and later in Austrian lands, it continued as a religious institution. The white cloak with the black cross remained, though it was now more ceremonial than militant. The vows endured. Poverty still meant renouncing personal wealth. Chastity still bound members to celibate life. Obedience still anchored the hierarchy. But the battlefield had changed. Charity, administration, and pastoral care gradually replaced campaigns and sieges. What lingered most was the idea of disciplined service. The Teutonic code had been forged in crusading fervour, but its internal logic, hierarchy, sacrifice, collective identity, proved adaptable. In later centuries, especially during periods of romantic nationalism, the medieval order was remembered not as a charitable brotherhood, but as a symbol of frontier expansion and iron discipline. 19th century writers reimagined the Teutonic Knights through a different lens, emphasizing martial valor and German cultural mission. Their Baltic campaigns were recast as civilizing efforts. Their castles became symbols of endurance and identity. History, as always, was selective. The harsher realities of forced conversion and political domination were softened in some retellings. The Black Cross became emblem rather than warning. Monastic austerity blended with military nostalgia. And yet, beneath reinterpretation, the original tension remained visible. How do you reconcile prayer with conquest? How do you vow poverty while governing wealthy lands? How do you claim spiritual obedience while exercising political authority? The Teutonic Knights wrestled with these contradictions for centuries. Their code was uncompromising. The world was not. By the time modern Europe emerged from the medieval order they once helped shape, the Teutonic Knights had transformed beyond recognition. But their story, of faith welded to force, of discipline entangled with ambition, continued to fascinate. Not because they were flawless, but because they embodied a powerful question. What happens when devotion becomes institutional power? The answer, written in brick castles and broken alliances, still stands across the Baltic landscape, silent, imposing, and complicated. Today, the Teutonic Knights no longer march beneath banners into battle. The modern order exists as a Catholic religious institution, engaged in charitable work and spiritual service. Its members no longer charge across frozen fields. They do not besiege cities. They do not collect tribute from conquered lands. And yet, the shadow of their past lingers. Across northern Poland and the Baltic region, their brick castles still dominate the landscape. Marienburg, now Malbork Castle, stands immense and imposing, a reminder of a time when warrior monks ruled as both abbots and generals. Tourists walk through vaulted halls where once vows were recited before campaigns. Stone walls that echoed with Latin chants later absorbed the thunder of war. The image remains powerful. A white cloak marked with a black cross. A knight kneeling in prayer before battle. A brotherhood sworn to poverty while commanding armies. It is a strange blend. Devotion and domination stitched into the same garment. Modern historians approach the order with caution. Romantic nationalism once glorified them as frontier heroes. Later scholarship examined the violence of forced conversion and territorial conquest. The truth lies in complexity. They were disciplined. They were devout. They were ambitious. They were ruthless. Their monastic code demanded obedience, but it also forged unity that allowed a small hospital brotherhood to become a Baltic power. Their vows demanded poverty, yet their institution accumulated wealth and influence. Their commitment to faith inspired sacrifice, yet it also justified warfare. The contradiction is the legacy. The Teutonic Knights remind us that institutions built on idealism can grow into political entities shaped by pragmatism. That spiritual conviction can inspire both charity and conquest. That discipline can be both stabilizing and rigid. The white cloak still exists. The black cross still carries weight. But the era of relentless crusade has long ended. What remains is a story of how faith, structure, and ambition intertwined to create one of medieval Europe's most formidable and controversial orders. A story not of simple heroism or villainy, but of men who believed obedience to God required steel in hand, and of a code that outlived the battlefield it once commanded.